Okay, so for this particular slide, we'll talk about the discussion section. We'll observe the same flow as what we had earlier. Take note that the discussion is where the authors explain meanings and implications of the result. The section pulls everything together and shows the importance and value of the work and is therefore the most innovative and difficult part of the paper to write. Later, we'll be providing some distinctions regarding what to annotate for the discussion part, especially as it may somehow intersperse with the result section. But to continue, take note that the discussion part is normally the last section of a research article. As expected, there will be some variations. Some variations may include the mention of conclusions, discussions and conclusions, discussion and limitations, conclusions and implications, or summary and implications. You might be confused, okay, but the conclusion and the discussion typically makes up the last part of the IMRAD paper. So while the variations we have here typically have the word conclusion, you might be wondering, where is it in the IMRAD? Why not IMRAD C? Okay, some papers refer to it as IMRAD C, but generally the format is but IMRAD only. Okay, and the discussion part would contain both discussions and conclusions. Then again, let's take a look at this next set of differences where the results section may have instances when both results and discussion are included. So in this situation wherein the results contain both the results and discussion, the discussion section may have the terms conclusion, pedagogic implication section, discussion then conclusion, discussion, pedagogical implications, conclusion, pedagogic implications, or pedagogic implication section then conclusion. So you might get confused by all these particular terms. Again, I will reiterate, okay, that in the hourglass figure, so we have the results first, and we may have results and discussion together. And this part of the discussion will just be taking note of certain parts for your annotation, okay? Parts that include limitations, or rather recommendations, limitations, and suggestions for future research. We'll elaborate on them later. Dictionary 2009 provides us an outline of how the moves in the conclusion are written. So this is more appropriate for understanding how our discussion section will be better understood. According to Dictionary, conclusion is where one primarily restates purpose, summarizes findings, provides evaluation of the study, and gives future recommendations. However, we will be dichotomizing some terms later in order for us to have a better understanding of what to annotate for the discussion section. Now, it is important to note that as you annotate for the salient points, a good discussion should not repeat what has already been said in the review of literature. However, we get to interpret it by basically comparing and contrasting previous work. The good discussion paper should also relate the results that were set out in the introduction. Hence, earlier, I've mentioned how your RQs must be setting a guide on annotating your results. It should explain theoretical background, especially in higher education level, okay, where you're more expected to look at things in an abstract way, indicate significance of the results, suggest future research suggestions, deal with the results reported in the study, Stay away from generalizations and conjectures that are not substantiated by results, and provide evidence for each. So we've taken note of so many things to consider for the discussion. But here are some salient points we will be annotating for the discussion part. Whether it's referred to as a discussion or conclusion or pedagogical implications and conclusion, as mentioned in the earlier variations that we have, okay? Here are the major things you need to look for in the last part of the IMRAD hourglass model. So, summary of findings, practical recommendations, disclosed limitations, and suggestions for future research. While we will not be including summary of findings anymore in the annotation, it is useful to verify if your results are, or the annotated results are the ones most significant from your annotations. But I'd like you to distinguish between recommendations and suggestions for future research. They sound synonymous, right? But let's refer to recommendations as the benefits to your stakeholders. So, what are the study's benefits in terms of the people who will benefit from this study? Like, say for example, the students, farmers, okay? And the suggestions for future research, while it also sounds like a recommendation, will be addressed to next researchers. The next researchers are going to improve this particular paper. Let's provide some further distinction. Here, we have practical recommendations, pedagogical implications from the paper, from this sample paper here. Notice that we have recommendations, okay? Here, although it's termed as suggestion, we will refer to it as recommendations because they provide some benefits to the following. So, administrators, okay? To school offices, to the curriculum, to the students, to the parents, community members, okay? But these recommendations are not for future researchers, okay? So, whenever we provide recommendations for future researchers, we will refer to them as suggestions for future researchers, okay? So, let's go to the limitations. The limitations, take note, may have a dedicated section, and it may even be found in some sentences in the methodology section. Sometimes it is implied, which means it might not be mentioned explicitly. But by identifying these limitations, you can use them to form gaps to be presented in your study. Okay, so keep an eye out for this particular section. So notice here that in this particular excerpt I have noted, we have limitations highlighted in red. Okay, so this would be talking about the weaknesses of the study. Okay, so when we say weaknesses of the study, it refers to methodological weaknesses. So in designing the study, what are the things that they have probably overlooked, that did not go well, they did not probably consider, they weren't able to improve anymore, okay? So the suggestions for future research would normally, or rather logically, follow this particular segment. So when we have limitations stated, the suggestions for future research section would be providing us the specific recommendations, or rather suggestions, in order for us to improve the next study, probably in terms of sampling, methods, or other variables. Okay, so let's take a look at this particular highlighted statement here. Okay, so notice how this part would mention other research entities are encouraged to conduct a similar study. okay, to validate the results and findings of the present study. So to validate the study is one thing that can be done or be suggested for future researchers, okay? And they're also suggesting that more studies should be conducted to explore on the difficulties of students, not only in academic writing essays, but in other types of writing. Okay, so these are again suggestions for future researchers. Notice that they are not addressing, at least explicitly or directly, the stakeholders. The recommendations provide the benefits of the study for the stakeholders, while the suggestions for future research provide certain improvements of the current study that the next researchers should be addressing. In this paper by Landicho 2020, we notice that the discussion section, or the last part of the article, if you're referring to the IMRAD again, is labeled conclusions and recommendations. Again, we mentioned earlier that there could be several variations, but what will we look for? We will look for summary of findings, recommendations, limitations, and suggestions for future research. So notice that this particular part here, highlighted here, talks about a summary of findings. Okay, so notice that this is addressing or summarizing answers to the research questions earlier presented. Let's take a closer look for this particular part here. So let's see if this part will contain the following: some limitations, recommendations, suggestions for future research. So the thing is, whatever would be the sequence of these three information, more or less we should expect them in the discussion part. Okay, so this particular part here, highlighted in red, is talking about the limitation of the paper. Okay, as it states that there are only 43 respondents in the study. Okay, the next part, however, where we have your further studies involving more researchers and schools could provide a more detailed account, is now referring to suggestions for future research. So notice that we say it's talking about suggestions for future research because there's also a mention of what further studies can do, okay, and what they can specifically address. Here, for the recommendations, we notice this highlighted portion here, okay, that would be addressed rather to schools and institutions, to administrators, in order for the paper, or rather the value of the paper, to be realized. You might be wondering if the particular sequence should always be observed. The thing is, while we do have a theoretical basis for the organization, not all papers follow the same sequence. But then again, you will be most likely be able to extract the important points that were mentioned in this particular part. So again, try to look out for limitations, suggestions for future research, and recommendations. And again, be able to distinguish suggestions for future research and recommendations. You might want to check again the Manchester Academic Phrase Bank, okay, so that you would be able to identify how writers would typically write about, say, the limitation of the study, or probably how they would write recommendations. And perhaps we can also have here other portions of the conclusions. At this point, I believe I am able to finish all the sections of the IMRAD already. Okay, now let's head on to some tips on how you will be able to answer the rest of the paper. Okay, so some suggestions I have for you would be to check the reference list of the papers that you're reading for future papers to be read. This is what we call, this was already mentioned in a previous lecture, so backward snowballing. Okay, so backward snowballing makes use of the current paper you're reading, or rather the reference list of the current paper you're reading, and looking for possible papers. Okay, make sure that you follow tips on how to identify relevant papers. You can also try doing forward snowballing to look for other references. Okay, so also check out the appendices. Okay, so in the appendices, you might be able to see some instrument sample, like it may contain the actual survey, or it may contain interview guides, or even analysis samples, which will be very much helpful when you're lost when it comes to the procedures of things. Okay, so never forget to check tables and figures, although these may already be found in the results, and you may not necessarily put this in the annotation book, but I think you can later on go back to the material, to the paper, and use this as a guide on how you will be able to write your own discussion paper. Okay, so for your own writing. For more tips, the next segment will talk about how we can incorporate AI